Hello and welcome to the Final Fantasy XIV Astrologian guide. My name is Julia and in this video I'll be covering the basics of DPS, healing and utility of the Astrologian job at level 90. One disclaimer, this video aims to teach you how to play Astrologian. For a guide on how to heal, check out this video instead. Astrologian is the Yu-Gi-Oh player of Final Fantasy. The job draws cards of fate and gives them to players to buff them with damage. A raid party in Final Fantasy consists of 2 tanks, 2 healers and 4 DPS. Astrologian fills one of the 2 healer spots. It does so alongside Scholar, Sage and White Mage. Astrologian and White Mage are considered regen healers, meaning they have access to on-demand regen spells and generally more powerful healing spells in terms of recovering raw HP. On the other hand, barrier healers like Scholar and Sage have access to on-demand shielding, but more restrictive toolkits for topping people off. It's also worth mentioning that in Final Fantasy, healers are basically caster DPS with extra responsibility. The DPS checks and enrages are balanced around healers contributing around 15% of the total raid DPS. This is why it's important to not only learn how to heal, but also how to DPS. Before talking about everything else, I first wish to talk about the card system, as this is a core part of the Astrologian job. It also is the thing that is the most overwhelming for new Astrologian players, and thus important to understand before learning the rest of the job. The Astrologian gauge consists of 3 main elements. The main card or arcana you have drawn, which is displayed in the bigger rectangle. The secondary card you have drawn is known as a minor arcana. And lastly, the seals you have acquired so far. These main cards or arcanas are acquired by drawing a card from your deck. You do this by using the draw ability. You can then play them by using the play ability. This then grants the card to the targeted party member. There are 6 different cards you can draw. They are split into 2 categories. The Ball, Ewer and Spire are your ranged cards. These cards grant cost to DPS, physical range DPS and healers a 6% damage increase for their duration. Alternatively, you can draw the Balance, the Spear and the Arrow. These cards grant the same 6% bonus when given to a melee DPS or a tank. If you give the card to the wrong role, say a Ball card to a melee, then this increases their damage only by 3%. This is why it's important to give the right card to the right player. Since drawing these cards is a game of chance, there naturally are times where you end up with too many cards of the same role. In these scenarios, it could be worth giving the wrong card to the wrong role, just to get them out and played. This scenario can be slightly mitigated by using the redraw ability, allowing you to draw a different card if the one you drew is not optimal for whatever reason. You can only use redraw once per draw ability. You can also undraw, placing the card back into your deck without drawing a new card. However, this is never worth doing, as a 3% damage increase on someone is better than a 0% on no one. Whenever you play a unique card, you end up storing this sign in your gauge as a seal. With these stored seals, you can cast the Astrologian ability. If you have 1 unique seal, you gain Harmony of the Spirit, which gradually restores your mana over 15 seconds. If you have 2 unique seals, you also gain Harmony of Body, which reduces your spell cast time and recast time and auto attack delay by 10%. Lastly, if you have 3 unique seals, then you gain Harmony of Mind, which increases your damage done and healing done by 5%. The Minor Arcana is gained by using the Minor Arcana ability. This draws either a Lord of Crowns or a Lady of Crowns, which can be played by repressing the ability. The Lord of Crowns deals moderate damage to all nearby enemies, while the Lady of Crowns restores a moderate amount of health to all nearby allies. These 2 cards are very powerful if utilized correctly. When using cards, your main goal is to acquire 2 unique seals to use for Astrologian. It sometimes is possible to gain 3, and this is a nice bonus, but it's not something you should aim for every time. Using Astrologian at 1 unique seal is almost never worth doing, and it usually is better to drift Astrologian until your next card to get a meaningful buff. As draw has 2 charges, you can time it to draw a card with the burst of your party without letting it overcap charges. As melee DPS do more damage than the ranged DPS, and tanks do more damage than healers, the melee oriented cards are usually worth more than the ranged ones. As giving cards to healers is usually not worth doing, it is sometimes worth putting a ranged card onto your melee DPS and vice versa. It is key that you align your cards with raid buffs and burst windows to maximize the value of the damage increase they give and the buffs you gain from the Astrologian ability. Doing this is relatively simple, as we can follow the 3-1-3 rule. This implies that in the opener you will play 3 cards, then 1 card in the odd minute and 3 cards in any even minute. This makes it so you prevent your cards from overcapping by spending the spare cards on the odd minute, and it then also has a greater number of cards to use during the even minute burst. Alongside the major arcana, your minor arcana can be used once per minute. If you draw a Lord of Crowns, then try to hold this for the next even minute burst. If you draw a Lady of Crowns, then try to align it with any place in the encounter where you could use some extra healing for comfort or recovery after mistakes. Astrologian you typically want to use during the even minute bursts, despite sometimes becoming available from your odd minute card. Simply hold on to the ability and use it alongside raid buffs. With the card system explained, let's move on to the main DPS actions you have access to. Your single target filler is a spell called Foul Malefic. This spell has a 1.5 second cast time with a 2.5 second recast time. This means you can move around for 1 second after each cast without interrupting your DPS uptime. You can also weave 1 OGCD after each cast. Like the other healers, Astrologian also have access to a damage over time debuff which it can apply to a target. This spell is combust free. Use this and keep it applied at all times. Starting at 4 or more targets, you can stop keeping it applied and solely focus on your AoE spell. Your AoE spell is Gravity 2. This does damage to enemies in a small area around your target. It becomes worth using over Foul Malefic at 2 or more targets. Alongside these free GCDs, Astrologians have access to a few OGCDs that help them deal damage. We already talked about the minor arcana, Lord of Crowns, which deals damage to nearby enemies. Divination is your raid buff. This increases the damage dealt by party members affected by 6% for 15 seconds. Keep this used on cooldown after the opener. If due to phase timings your party ends up delaying raid buffs, then also delay Divination alongside them. Next is Earthly Star. This places a star on the battlefield which after 10 seconds upgrades to do more damage and healing. After 20 seconds total, it explodes, healing everyone in range and dealing damage to all enemies. This ability is primarily used for damage purposes and should be kept on cooldown. You could drift it slightly to heal a mechanic if it means you do not lose any usage of this ability throughout the course of the fight, or if it means you are able to hit several targets with it. The time it is used pre-pull varies to optimize its healing use, and recommended star timings can be found in the balance. As you can pop the star anytime in a 10-second window after it enlarges, you gain some flexibility in its use, and its heal can also not be understated. During progression, it is expected to optimize by planning around the natural timings of your star explosions and heals in that fight. Earthly Star is also stronger than Foul Malefic, and thus losing a GCD of Malefic is worth it if it means you gain a usage of Earthly Star by doing so. Lastly, you have Lightspeed. This ability reduces the cast time of all your spells by 2.5 seconds for 15 seconds. This is used in the even minute bursts windows to make your weaving cards easier. The Astrologian opener is very approachable, so let's walk through it real quick. Ideally, Astrologians start their opener 25 seconds before the pull, however this can be annoying during progress as it takes up a lot of time during raid nights. To mitigate this slightly, you can draw instantly before your respawn between pulls while the screen is still black, making the timer 15 seconds after the gates disappear instead of 25 seconds after the countdown begins. The opener also changes based on which cards you draw. I will explain the perfect RNG opener first, and then we can talk about adjustments after. 30 seconds prior to pulling, draw your first card. If this is not your desired card, then redraw it. Use Earthly Star anywhere from -20 seconds to -4 seconds. When you exactly want to use this is fight dependent. If using a Tincture on pull, use it 3 seconds before pulling. Start by casting Foul Malefic 1.5 seconds before pulling. Weave in Lightspeed and instantly cast Combust Free. We will consider this your first GCD. Play your card and draw your next card. From here on, continue using your GCD by casting Foul Malefic until you need to refresh your Combust Free, while weaving OGCDs in the following order. Play your card on the second GCD, and draw another card instantly. Use Divination on the third GCD and play your card. Weave in your Minor Arcana and Astrologian on your fourth GCD. If you drew a Lord of Crowns, then use this after your fifth GCD. If you drew a Lady, then hold this for healing later on. Here's an example of the opener being done. Like I said earlier, the opener is heavily RNG based, and thus which cards you will draw will change the way you weave in between the Fall Malefic costs. If you had perfect cards drawn, then simply do what I showed earlier. If you require to redraw a card, then do so like these examples. One thing to note is that divination is always used on the first weave of your second Fall Malefic cast after Combust, to keep this aligned with your party's burst. After the opener, simply keep Combust applied at all times and use Fall Malefic as much as possible. Remember to play your cards using the 3-1-3 rule. Use 3 cards in the opener, then 1 on the odd minute and 3 again on any subsequent even minute bursts. Draw your first even minute card before the burst actually starts to avoid overcapping. Simply play it during the burst. Alongside this card management, keep in mind Astrologian. We want 2 unique seals to gain the haste buff each time we use it. This is fairly easy to obtain, and you can redraw to force this. After you get your second unique seal, do not force a third. Simply use redraw to try to get the cards for the ideal roles in your party. The 2-minute burst is fairly straightforward. Continue to cast Fall Malefic and keep your Combust applied, and use the following weaves in these orders. A reminder to always use divination on cooldown. The rest of your abilities you can use whenever you have a chance to do so without clipping your GCD. Lightspeed is used at the start of your burst to give you more slots to weave in your abilities. If you draw a Lord of Crowns on your second Minor Arcana, you can hold this and use it within the burst window as well. Here's an example of that burst window being done. Lastly, the main way healers can improve their damage is by improving their uptime. This implies that you can use Fall Malefic as much as possible and utilize the 1 second time after the cast to move ahead of mechanics, so you're pre-positioned when a mechanic happens and you don't have to move last minute to react. By being pre-positioned for mechanics, you minimize the amount of time you have to spend without your GCD running. It is also key that you keep your Combust dot applied at all times, and that you refresh it every 30 seconds before it falls off. It's worth noting that Combust is an instant cast and thus allows you to move for 2.5 seconds, which you can utilize to move much further than the 1 second window of Fall Malefic. You can use Swift Cast to instantly cast your next Fall Malefic and also move for 2.5 seconds. Keep in mind that using Swift Cast for DPS is only worth it if you are sure that raising is not an issue in the next minute. You could even plan your macro Cosmos usage to align with movement, as it's an instant cast and thus grants you a free GCD of movement. Lastly, there's a 500 millisecond gap at the end of every casted spell where you can move. This movement is called slide casting. With the difficult part of Astrologian out of the way, let's talk about the healing actions you have access to. The more efficiently you heal, the more GCDs you can spend on your Fall Malefic casts, and thus the more damage you deal. As a healer, it is key to understand the damage losses from certain heals. Generally, free healing costs you no damage. This consists of OGCD abilities that cost nothing to use, but are restricted by your cooldown. GCD heals are usually costly. These take up a Fall Malefic cost to use, costing a whole 250 potency to use. The only exception is your Macrocosmos. Your goal is to minimize the amount of GCD heals cost by utilizing your free heals to their fullest extent. It is worth noting that during progress, it is encouraged to use your GCD heals for the sake of safety. For more information, you can check out the healer guide here. I will be splitting the healer actions into single target and AoE healing, starting with the single target GCDs. These actions cost you a Fall Malefic cast and extra mana to use. Benefic heals a single target after a 1.5 second cast time. This spell has a 2.5 second recast time similar to Fall Malefic. The heal itself is fairly bad and should only be used if you do not have access to Benefic 2. Benefic 2 works the same way, but heals more at a slightly higher mana cost. It generally doesn't see much usage outside of scenarios where someone requires immediate single target healing, or scenarios where you have Sinistry, an ability we will cover later. Aspected Benefic is your main single target GCD heal. This spell heals less than Benefic 2 on its initial heal, but also applies a heal over time onto the target, which ends up healing almost twice the amount of Benefic 2 after its full duration. You can use this to heal up tanks gradually after hard-hitting auto attacks or party members after they sustain bleed debuffs. Moving on to your single target OGCDs. These actions are free to use and cost you no DPS. Essential Dignity is a heal with a very short cooldown and 2 charges. Try to use this more frequently to heal single targets. The neat thing about this ability is that it heals more the lower a target's health is. So if you're throwing out several heals onto the target, use Essential Dignity first to make use of this mechanic to its fullest extent. Celestial Intersection works similarly. It also has a very short cooldown and it can hold 2 charges. It heals a target and then applies a barrier to them. First and foremost, use this frequently to keep the tanks topped up. Don't let it sit idle though. If you're about to overcap charges, you can alternatively use this to top up a DPS after they sustain damage. Exaltation grants a target a buff that reduces incoming damage by 10% for 8 seconds. After these 8 seconds, it also heals the target for a moderate amount. This ability is very powerful, but it's important to choose when to use it. Simply using it as much as possible in the fight might see you gain more uses out of the ability, but you can probably get more value out of it by choosing specific high damage moments to use, such as hard-hitting tank busters or raid wights that might kill your squishier party members without a little extra love. You can also use this during boss fights where the boss auto attacks hit very hard, mitigating them partially for the tanks. Lastly, Sinestry buffs a target for 20 seconds. This person receives 40% of the single target GCD heals you do as a bonus. Do mind that this bonus only applies to the initial heal and not to any regens applied. Since we try to avoid using GCD heals, this ability doesn't see much usage. You could use this in dire situation, where you try to keep 2 players alive, but you can only funnel your healing into 1. You could also apply this to a single target who is in dire need of healing, boosting the single target GCD heals you use on them effectively by 40%. This could also be used to reduce the amount of mana you spend healing them, as you'd have to cast 40% less heals to heal the same amount. Let's move on to your AoE healing, starting with the GCDs. These actions again cost you a foul malefic to cast and extra mana to use. Helios heals your allies around you after a 1.5 second cast and has a 2.5 second recast like Benefic. This heal also does not see much usage. Instead, opt to use Aspected Helios unless you already have a regen from Aspected Helios ticking and you require more healing. Aspected Helios has a lower initial heal, but does apply a heal over time to all party members hit, making the total healing it does significantly higher. If you are forced to GCD heal, use this over a regular Helios unless the heal over time is not enough healing and you require extra healing immediately. Lastly, you have Macrocosmos. This is Astrologian's signature healing spell. It firstly does damage to all enemies around you. This damage is equal to a foul malefic cast, so on a single target encounter this spell is damage neutral. Next, it gives all party members around you a buff for 15 seconds. 50% of the damage the players take in those 15 seconds is stored up, and after the buff expires, or if you manually recast the ability, they are healed for this stored amount. A few things to note is that the damage done onto barriers does not add up to this amount. If manually activating it, it only heals party members in a 20 yalm radius around you. If you let it naturally expire, this does not apply. And if manually activating it, the second cast will be an OGCD instead of an GCD. This spell is extremely powerful. Try to use it to its fullest extent. We move on to your OGCD AoE heals. We already talked about Earthly Star. This ability should first and foremost be used for DPS purposes and used on cooldown as much as possible. However, if you can drift it to heal a raid-wide damage without it costing you a usage of the ability, then it's worth doing so. Collective Unconsciousness is a channeling ability that gives you a 10% damage mitigation and a 15-second heal over time buff to all party members. This ability can be channeled for 18 seconds. Doing so refreshes the heal over time constantly back to its full duration. Since it's a channeling ability, it technically stops your uptime. However, it can be flashed as a regular OGCD instead. This applies the heal over time buff for 15 seconds and still grants party members the damage mitigation for 5 seconds. Utilizing this ability this way makes it very powerful, and thus should frequently be used to deal with incoming raid-wide damage. Celestial Opposition is a simple AoE heal that also applies a heal over time. It functions similarly to Aspected Helios, however it is an ability with a 60-second cooldown, this is free to use. Try to utilize this as much as possible to heal up after raid-wide damage. Horoscope grants all party members a buff for 10 seconds. When the buff runs out, or if you manually cast the ability again, it heals the players for a small amount. You can also increase this amount by using one of the 2 AoE GCD heals on them. This also increases the duration of the buff to 30 seconds. The ability generally is free to use, so long you do not use the Aspected heal spells. If you ever are forced to use one of these expected heals, however, then try to combine it with Horoscope to increase Horoscope's value. Neutral Sect increases the healing potency of your GCD heals by 20% for 20 seconds. If you use either expected heals during this buff, it also creates a barrier based on the amount of health healed. You can use this if you are forced to use your expected heals, and you could also benefit from additional barriers that they would apply. This ability is incredibly strong and is one of the reasons why Astrologian's healing capabilities are unparalleled. Lastly, we already talked about Lady of Crowns. This ability is given by your Minor Arcana ability. You can simply use this whenever you are in need of extra healing or potentially drop a GCD and heal with this ability instead. You should make sure to spend it before your next Minor Arcana comes off cooldown, even if it means you heal nothing at all. Astrologian naturally also has access to the healer role actions. Ascend uses a large chunk of mana, and you are able to raise a fallen party member after a long 8-second cast. You are able to use Swift Cast to negate the long cast time, making this spell a lot more reasonable to cast. Swift Cast makes your next spell instant cast. This can be used to maintain uptime by extending your movement. This ability is also great to combo with the earlier mentioned Ascent, as it removes the 8-second long cast time of the race. Esuna is your Cleanse. Using this spell removes one random cleansable debuff. This can be recognized by the blue line above the icon. Lucid Dreaming applies a buff that restores mana over the course of its duration. Using this spell on cooldown is important to maintain your mana over the course of the fight, so try to use this spell whenever your mana dips below 80%. Surecast is your knockback immunity. It also doubles down and stops your cast from being interrupted. Rescue allows you to pull one party member towards you. You can use this to save party members who you can see standing in the wrong place for a mechanic. However, if you are not confident in the usage of this spell, you can actually end up doing more harm than good. Use this ability then carefully. Repose simply puts an enemy to sleep. However, the sleep is broken whenever the target is damaged. This spell rarely sees use outside of niche content like the deep dungeons. If you are struggling for hotbar real estate, then this is the first action you unbind. Thank you for watching, I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more Final Fantasy XIV content and guides. A special thanks to all of the healer theory crafters who helped make this guide a reality.